Everyone, happy Tuesday. Hope you are having a great day today. Today I'm going to talk about autolysis. And this is kind of an important thing in winemaking, in some aspects of winemaking more so than others, but it kind of happens in all of winemaking. And then depending on what style of wine you are making, it will determine whether you really use autolysis or not. So the first thing we need to talk about with autolysis is enzymes. So all living things have enzymes in them. And enzymes are catalysts, and they are there to bring about biochemical reactions. So the two most important biochemical reactions that let the world go round and round is going to be photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So between these two reactions, oxygen is released into the environment for us to breathe, and then we take in that oxygen and we release carbon dioxide, and then the plants take that carbon dioxide in and they complete that cycle. So that's how we're getting oxygen and carbon dioxide replacing into the environment. So now in the winemaking process, we've talked about yeast over and over and over again because they are so important. So we've talked about fermentation in the past, and we know that if it wasn't for yeast eating those sugars within the grapes, we would not have wine. Now, yeast occur actually naturally on the grapes, okay? And they naturally occur within the winery. And it is the winemaker's decision whether to use these native yeast or to stop the growth of the native yeast and introduce commercial yeast. So whether native or commercial yeast is used during the process of fermentation, in addition to the alcohol and carbon dioxide in the production, there are secondary metabolites. And these secondary metabolites get released, and this is what influences the aromas and the taste of the wine. Okay? So the degradation of the yeast is heavily influenced by both temperature and pH. So this is why winemakers, especially during that fermentation process, are paying extremely close attention to what that temperature is while that fermentation is going on. Since wine is typically found between 3 and 4 in the pH range, and approximately we keep it at like 65 degrees Fahrenheit, autolysis actually doesn't really happen right off the bat. And that's a good thing, because if they died off quickly, we would not have the alcohol in the wine that we would like. Now, during the life cycle of yeast, it's going to go through a few stages, okay? And these life cycle of the yeast, these stages kind of overlap. So while some of the yeast are doing one stage, another yeast is progressing into the next stage, and vice versa. Okay, so they're all progressing. Everything doesn't happen at once, right? So the first stage is known as the lag phase. And during the lag phase, this is where stored glycogen is broken down by that yeast into glucose, and the yeast are going to use that energy so that they can prepare for reproduction. Because remember, every living thing's goal is really to reproduce. So the yeast don't really know they're doing us a favor making alcohol for us. They're just trying to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. During the growth phase, which is also known as respiration phase, the yeast has taken up this stored up glycogen reserves, and now they start reproducing, which is why it's called the growth phase, right? And this is super easy. As we're starting to get into that next stage, that fermentation phase, we get to see this foam that starts coming in. This means that the yeast are being active in there. Think about if you've ever made bread or dough, right? You take that yeast, you give it some water, warm water to wake it up, you throw some sugar in there, and all of a sudden it starts to get frothy. The same exact thing is happening in the grapes, in the juice that's going on here. Okay, so we get to see this. Now, the fermentation is when the yeast are physically eating the sugar, and then they're releasing that carbon dioxide and alcohol into the juice. The thing is that is their waste product. Okay, so alcohol, good for us, bad for the yeast. Okay, and the amount of alcohol in the wine is in a direct relationship to how much sugar is actually within the fruit. Okay? So as the yeast continue to metabolize that sugar, the increased level of alcohol in the juice becomes toxic to them. And most yeast can survive somewhere in the vicinity of about 14 to 15% alcohol before dying off. But since alcoholic levels have increased, scientists have started to create new yeast that are actually more tolerant. And now we can have alcohol levels up to 17% where the yeast are still able to continue to produce more alcohol. Now, once the yeast reach their alcohol threshold, they begin to die off. Okay, and this occurs, here's the geeky part, okay, this occurs because the proteins within the yeast begin to break down, causing issues with their cellular membrane. And then the messenger RNA that's inside the nucleus of that yeast cell begins to change, and it triggers stress, and the reaction is releasing a protein called kinase, and this kinase causes a disintegration of the cell wall. And once that cell wall is broken, boom, the yeast are dead. Okay? So once the yeast are dead, they're going to sink down to the bottom of the barrel or the tank. Okay? Or if we're making champagne and we're doing a secondary fermentation in bottle, they're going to sink down to the bottom of the bottle. And you're able to actually see the yeast all the way down on the bottom. Okay? So if the lees, at this point, those dead yeast cells are called lees. And if the lees are allowed to remain in contact with the wine, then the enzymes in the wine start to break down those dead yeast cells. And this autolysis produces amino acids which release proteins and carbohydrates into the wine. Yay for us! Because these byproducts are what leads to that richer, that creaminess, that bread-like aromas and flavors. Now, if we're keeping these lees in the barrel or in the tank or whatever, we don't want them sitting down on the bottom because then they're only in contact with that little itty bitty part of the wine. We want that flavors and those aromatics to come all the way through. So what we actually do with this autolysis is that we actually benefit this by leaving it in there, and then we're going to stir it. So this is what we do if we're riddling, okay, in the champenois method, or if we have white wine, we are stirring it, as you can see in this image, and this is called batonnage. And this is done completely to increase the contact of those lees that are being broken down into that wine, and they are going to release the flavors throughout the whole barrel or a tank or whatever we're doing it in. So that is autolysis, the breaking down due to the enzymes of those yeast cells, okay? And then we are going to use them in that winemaking process to give us additional flavors, depth, dimension, aromatics to our wine. So I hope you enjoyed autolysis. I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday. Please like, share, save, all that good stuff here. Let people know that on Tuesdays I do get live. Head on over to Paso and come visit us in our downtown tasting room. If you have any questions about winemaking processes or something you'd like me to talk about, leave me a comment, let me know, and have a fantastic week. Sláinte!